Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Lord of Vik-lo by James L. Nelson, narrated by Shaun Grindell. Prologue. The Saga of Thorgrim Ulfson. There was a man named Thorgrim, the son of Ulf Harald's son, who owned a farm in East Agder in Vik in the country of Norway. Though he was no bigger than most men, Thorgrim possessed great strength and was a skilled warrior. This he proved many times while going a Viking with the Jarl Ornolf Ravnsson, known as Ornolf the Restless, for whom he served as a herdman. After Thorgrim had gained much wealth over many summers of raiding with Ornolf, he brought more land and livestock and slaves, and was wed to Ornolf's daughter, Halbera, with the Jarl's blessings. Thorgrim presented Ornolf with 50 silver coins as a bride price, and Ornolf gave Thorgrim a farm north of East Agder, which some years later Thorgrim gave to his first son, Odd. Thorgrim and Halbera had 3 children, Odd, Harald, and Hield. Though he had a reputation as a warrior, Thorgrim was also known as a clever farmer and a man skilled in working with wood. His advice was often sought, and though Thorgrim was not given to lengthy speeches, he was always happy to help when he could, and his words were greeted with much respect. There was only one thing about Thorgrim that made his neighbours uneasy. On certain days, when the sun went down, he became so irritable and so short-tempered that none dared approach him. Some believed that he was a shapeshifter and took the form of a wolf during the night, which is why he came to be known as Thorgrim Night Wolf. When Thorgrim's daughter Hield was 10 years old, Halbera found herself once again with child. She gave birth to a daughter, whom Thorgrim named Halbera after his wife, who died giving birth. After that, Thorgrim did not want to remain on his farm, so he followed his father-in-law, Ornolf, west to go a Viking. This time he brought his second son, Harald, who was 15 and powerfully built, so much so that he soon earned the name Broadarm. Ornolf's ship was called Red Dragon, and he sailed it to a longphort on the coast of Ireland, which the Irish people called Dubh-linn. Ornolf had such a great fondness for food and drink that Thorgrim usually took charge of the ship and men when they went a Viking. On their way to Dubh-linn, they plundered an Irish ship and stole from it a wonderful crown, which the Irish called the Crown of the 3 Kingdoms, and which they esteemed and coveted very much. This led to many adventures among the Irish people, as there were many who wished to possess the crown for the king. Who wore it would wield great authority in that land. While the Irish were fighting amongst themselves, Thorgrim and his men plundered the church in a place called Tara, which was considered the seat of the king of Ireland, though few in Ireland recognized a single king of that country, but rather each part recognized its own king. The Vikings found great riches at Tara, but Thorgrim was gravely wounded through the treachery of one of the jarls in their company, whom Thorgrim had helped free from the Irish. This was in the year 852 by the Christian calendar, 59 years after the first Northmen sailed west and plundered the monastery at Lindisfarne. By that time, Thorgrim Night Wolf was tired of raiding and wished only to return to his farm in East Agder. His son, Harald, was not eager to go home, but he was a good son and did as he was commanded by his father. During his adventures in Ireland, Thorgrim had come into possession of a ship which he named Far Voyager. After Thorgrim had mostly recovered from his wound, he determined to sail back to Norway. So he found a crew of more than 50 men and loaded Far Voyager with provisions and goods to trade, and the plunder he had accumulated in Ireland. Then he put to sea, bound home to Vik. Here is what happened. Chapter 1. The first prey was taken by the heathens from southern Brega, and they carried off many prisoners, and killed many, and led away very many captive. The Annals of Ulster. They could hear the battle before they could see it. The longship Eagle's Wing was sailing fitfully north and east, with the coast of Ireland less than a mile off her larboard side. The wind was coming in puffs. Sometimes it heeled the long, sharp vessel over and drove her along, and sometimes it dropped off to a mere breath, until the ship stood upright on her keel, her forward motion barely discernible, the sail and rigging flogging and banging as she rolled in the swell. Aft, half leaning on the tiller, stood the Dane, Grimarr Knudsen of Hedeby. He was known as Grimarr Giant, and with good reason. For even though he was not strictly speaking a giant, it was not hard to imagine that his father had been of that race, even if his mother was human. Grimarr stood more than a head above any of the 60 warriors who manned Eagle's Wing, and was as broad as any two of them standing side by side. No one knew the limit of his strength, because no one had the courage to test it. Just forward of where Grimarr stood, on the starboard side, was his son, Sandar, who was sitting on a small chest. Sandar's leg, injured in a fight the year before, and never quite healed, was thrust out straight. Sandar was his eldest son, his only son now, and while he had inherited some of his father's size, he had not inherited the strength that went with it. Not that Sandar was a weakling, or had not proved himself in battle, but he was not the man his father was. It was a fact that everyone knew, but no one dared say. Sandar was also more clever than his father, more clever by far. That was another thing that went unsaid, at least in Grimarr's presence. A gust came, a puff of wind that pushed Eagle's Wing down on her larboard side, and drove her along with a pulse of speed. Grimarr shifted the tiller a bit, turned the ship harder into the wind. Beyond the larboard bow, a great headland rose up out of the sea, the water breaking white around its base, an impressive promontory that put Grimarr in mind of the stunning fjords of his homeland. They would have to drive Eagle's Wing around that headland, and then stand north some distance before they could fetch their home port, their Irish home port, the longphort of Vik-lo. The sail and the rigging grew taut under the pressure of that breeze, and the banging and slating stopped, despite the light wind. The sail was reefed to ease the pressure on the cracked and hastily repaired plank aft of the mast, but Grimarr could still hear the gurgling sound of water running the length of her hull, the soft creak of the mast, and the shrouds as they took up the strain. He saw men glancing out to windward, hoping, he was sure, that this breeze would hold. Eagle's Wing would likely have made better time under oar than sailing in that fluky wind, but they were in no great hurry, and Grimarr reckoned he should give the men a rest rather than trying to wring every bit of speed out of his ship. This was a calculation, one in which the men's comfort played little part. Grimarr was thinking instead about how much effort he might expect from his exhausted men, of what might happen if they found themselves suddenly plunged into a bloody fight. It was a possibility he needed always to keep in mind. Like troops held in reserve during a battle, some bit of the men's strength had to be preserved whenever Eagle's Wing was in the near presence of danger, which was every moment she was not safe in the longphort of Vik-lo. A raid on a monastery in a town the Irish called Fana, a hard 2 weeks, had worn the men down. Fana was not a coastal town, but 1 miles inland, up a river called Slaney, and then another called the Bann. Eagle's Wing and another longship, Sea Rider, had crawled for miles upstream, the rivers more difficult to manoeuvre than Grimarr and Fasti Magnusson, who commanded Sea Rider, had anticipated. The current was swift. The sandbars rode up from the river bottom in places they did not suspect, and grabbed the bows of the longships, shallow draught though they were. until sometimes the 100 or so men in the raiding party had to clamber over the sides into the cold river and drag the vessels free. It had rained, a near constant deluge, but that was hardly unusual in that country, or so Grimarr had come to understand. The voyage had been hellish. The raid, however, had been a great success. For 2 generations now, the monasteries and centres of wealth along the Irish coast had been plundered and picked clean, but only now were the longships moving inland, the Northmen using the great rivers of Ireland as a means to raid far from the sea. The people of Farna had been unaware of the coming threat. The monastery there had yielded up a great trove of silver, some gold, some jewels. They had taken all the slaves they could carry aboard the 2 ships, which in truth were not many, given that they had just 2 ships. The return voyage to the sea, however, had been worse than the hard pull inland. The rushing water carried them along, but it also jammed them hard into the islands of mud, pinned them against the high banks. Skilled oarsmen though the Northmen were, it was exhausting work to keep the ships in the deep water of the stream, a nightmare to free them from the bottom when they could not. The ships were deeper in the water after the raid on Farna, burdened with treasure and slaves, and that only compounded the difficulty. At last they had made it to the mouth of the river. The bank spread wide as if to release them. The sea a great arc of blue beyond the bows, open arms beckoning. Now, free of the river, the rugged coast passing down the ship's side, Grimarr Giant wanted only to return to Vik-lo, unimpressive as the longphort was, and be done with Eagle's Wing for a time. The gust that hilled them over carried the longship ahead for 50 boat lengths, made the wake foam in a long white path astern, gave every man aboard a spark of hope that it would hold steady and drive them right around the towering, rocky cliffs to larboard. And just as it seemed the breeze might hold, the wind puffed and settled and died away. Grimarr could sense the frustration that rippled through the crew, and then, through the flogging rigging and the gentle flap of the oiled wool-cloth of the sail, Grimarr heard another noise, distant but familiar, a noise that his mind picked out from all the others, barely audible, but with all the urgency of someone shouting an alarm. The clang of steel on steel, weapon on weapon. From his slumped position over the tiller, Grimarr stood straight upright and cocked his ear in the direction from which the sound had come. No one else aboard seemed to have heard it. There was no pause in the low, muttered conversations that were taking place fore and aft. "Silence!" Grimarr roared, and the men fell quiet with the abrupt finality of a candle's flame snuffed out. Eagle's Wing was barely making way in the failing breeze, the water along her side just the merest hint of sound, the sail flapping gently. With her men sitting in absolute silence, every ear straining now, the sound Grimarr heard was repeated, augmented, joined by the muted sounds of shouting. It was a battle. There was no mistaking it. Every man on board had heard those sounds time and again, and every one of them recognized it immediately for what it was. "Oh, by Odin's sweet ass!" Grimarr shouted. Whoever was fighting was doing so on the far side of the headland, and the massive cliffs all but blotted out the sound that they would have otherwise have heard well before then. And if there was fighting on the north side of the headland, Grimarr knew who was doing that fighting. On one side at least. One of the combatants was most certainly Fasti Magnusson, a bold sea rider. Grimarr had a fair idea of who the other might be. "You sons of whores!" he shouted to his men still seated at the rowing benches. "Get that sail down! Get the oars out! Move, damn you, or I'll rip the lungs out of every one of you!" Grimarr had not completed the threat before every man aboard was in motion, casting off the halyard, casting off the braces, swinging the yard fore and aft as it came down the mast, and bundling the sail against it. grabbing the oars up from the gallows on which they were stored and passing them along the length of the deck. Sandar pushed himself to his feet, limped over to the starboard brace, cast it free. They were not motivated by fear of Grimarr this time, and he knew it. Like him, they stood to lose a fortune if the worst of their suspicions proved true. The ship's upper strake was pierced with holes, through which the oars could pass, and each hole was fitted with a small shutter to keep the water from pouring through when the ship heeled enough to put the sheer strake in the sea. Now these shutters were deftly swung aside, and the oars thrust through the holes, oars of varying length to accommodate the width of the ship at every station. Complicated, potentially chaotic as that evolution might be, it took the men of Eagle's Wing less than a minute to transform the ship from a wallowing vessel under the indifferent power of its sail into a swift, oar-powered craft, shooting ahead like an arrow. They were well practiced at this, and well motivated. The bad luck that had plagued their raiding voyage had not left them, even after Eagle's Wing and Sea Rider had cleared the river Slaney. For the remainder of the day, they had made the best of their way up the coast, then beached for the night on a shingle strand. The following morning, they had heaved the longships back out into the sea, set sail to a favourable and steady breeze, and continued to claw their way north. It was near noon when Grimarr noticed the water coming in over the deck-boards. There was only a narrow space between the planks fastened down to the frames and the bottom of the ship beneath. Water usually sloshed around there from the low-sided ship, dipping her gunwales when heeling to a gust or a cloudburst filling the open vessel like a trough. The men were accustomed to bailing out what was within reach, and they were doing so now. But only Grimarr seemed to notice they were having to bail with considerably greater frequency.
"Where, by the gods, is all this cursed water coming from?"
he demanded. A few of the deck-boards were left loose for bailing, storage, and access to the hull. These were pulled up, and the planks below inspected, but no problems could be found. Then more deck-boards were pried free. And just aft of the mast step, right where the base of the mast exerted a great levering force on the hull, they found a plank cracked clean through. It was an ugly gash that ran for several feet, and gushed water every time the ship rolled in the seas. For a moment, Grimarr and the others stood looking at the lacerated strake that bled seawater at a prodigious rate. Then Eagle's Wing rolled again, and the wood made an audible cracking noise, and the water came spouting in faster still.
"Oh, may Odin take this damned rotten pig trough!"
Grimarr shouted in frustration. He looked to the west, found a spot where it seemed the generally rocky and inhospitable Irish coast tapered down to a beach, and where they might ground the ship. They would have to try. If some sort of repair was not made to the strake, Eagle's Wing would not stay afloat much longer. She certainly would not make the voyage to Vik-lo in such condition.
"Get the sail down. Get out the oars. We'll ground her yonder,"
Grimarr grumbled to the men. In a louder voice he hailed Sea Rider, sailing a couple 100 ells further out to sea, and conveyed to them the message that he was heading for shore. He did not bother trying to explain why. An hour before sunset, both ships were hauled up, and guards were posted in a wide arc around the camp to defend against any surprises. By Grimarr and Fasti's reckoning, they were well within the land, ruled by the Irishman Lorcan mac Phelan. The Northmen might call this place Vik-lo, but to the Irish it was Kilventine, and it was Lorcan's country. Grimarr had come to understand that every pathetic cow pasture or squalid cluster of huts in Ireland had a king, what the Irish called a ri tuatha, and most of them were no more kings or warriors than the peasants over whom they lauded their authority. But not so Lorcan mac Phelan. Lorcan was very much a king, even if the territory he ruled was barely large enough to be called a kingdom. Grimarr had no doubt that Lorcan was eager to expand that kingdom, and he had the men and the courage to do it. Expanding his rule meant, among other things, driving the Dubh-linn back into the sea. Grimarr was not afraid of Lorcan. He was not afraid of any man, but he considered the Irishman a genuine adversary, and a threat not to be taken lightly. And that was about the most respect Grimarr could give to anyone. With their ships pulled up on the beach, vulnerable as stranded whales, the Norsemen considered their options. If Lorcan attacked, he would do so with overwhelming force. The most they could hope for in that circumstance was to get away, so they figured they had better be ready to do just that. They shoved Searider back out into the water, made her fast to a tree ashore by a long walrus hide rope. They loaded all of the loot from the raid on Fana aboard the one sound vessel. If the Irish attacked, the Northmen might still get away aboard that ship, carrying their riches with them. They spent 2 days on the beach, heaving Eagle's Wing over on her side and getting at the cracked plank as best they could. 2 days, during which word of their presence must certainly have reached Lorcan. Repairs nearly done, and Fasti's men eager to be gone, and with the Irish still nowhere to be seen, it was agreed that Searider should get under way. No one would feel comfortable until the plunder from Fana was safely within the walls of Vik-lo. Grimarr and the crew of Eagle's Wing would be half a day behind at most, and they would meet again at the longphort. There was only a few men in the world whom Grimarr would allow to sail off with a fortune that was half his. Fasti was one of them. Searider was nearly hull down to the north when they pushed Eagle's Wing back into the sea and found that the repair they had made was not holding, the water still pouring in. Out she came once more, hove back on her side. An additional patch of wood, well slathed with tar, was clench-nailed over the cracked plank, and that at last seemed to hold. By then it was dark, and so the men pushed the ship into the shallow water and made it fast to the tree that had held Searider, and there they spent the night. They were under way at first light, following in Searider's wake. That was 2 days past, and now the men of Eagle's Wing were leaning hard into the oars, forcing every foot of headway out of the ship, desperate to get around the headland and into the fight beyond, because every man knew, as Grimarr did, that the battle involved Fasti Magnusson and his men. It had to be thus. The Irish were not seafarers. They did not engage in sea fights. Any fight on the water had to involve Northmen, and Searider was the only ship Grimarr knew for certain was nearby. She should have been safely back to Vik-lo by now. Why she was not, Grimarr could not imagine, but that did not shake his belief that it was Fasti locked in that fight. Fasti, his friend. Fasti, who had Grimarr's share of the Fana treasure aboard his vessel. Chapter 2. I was outnumbered, yet I fed the ravens more. Gisli Sursen's saga. They rounded the headland. So close Grimarr could feel the spray on his face from the seas crashing against the ship, killing rocks. Off the larboard bow, the land seemed to drop away as the coastline ran off to the north and west. A near 90-degree bend around the high cliffs, to where the shore ran for another few miles to Vik-lo. The sound of the fight was louder now, the metal clang of sword on sword, of axe on helmet, the shouting of furious men, the screaming of dying men, louder, but Grimarr still could not see it. Fore and aft the men at the rowing thwarts craned their heads around, trying to get a glimpse beyond the bow.
"Keep your minds on your damned oars,"
Grimarr roared.
"I'll tell you when there's something to see."
Head snapped back, muscled arms pulled at the long wooden shafts, and Eagle's Wing shot through the water. And then he saw them, the combatants, visible at last as Eagle's Wing doubled the far end of the headland. Grimarr cursed out loud, shouted oaths to the sky, pounded the tiller with his fist. Sea Rider was a half-mile away, low in the water, listing to larboard from the weight of the men, the dozens and dozens of men locked in a bloody struggle on her deck. She was surrounded by boats, low and black in the water. Irish boats, what the Irish people called curraghs. They were flimsy things, insubstantial frames of wood covered in oak bark tanned oxhide. Nothing compared to the great Viking longships. What they lacked in size and stoutness, however, they made up for in numbers. Here was a swarm of curraghs that altogether might have carried 100 men or more. They had been waiting just north of the headland. Grimarr guessed, had stuck fast as soon as the longship had come into view. They must have been watching from shore, tracking Sea Rider's progress. They looked to Grimarr like a pack of wolves set on a furious bull. Sea Rider was surrounded. The curraghs had come at her from all sides, the Irishmen at their oars climbing overboard, overwhelming the Norsemen, or trying to in any event. Fasti and his men were fighting back with the fury of their race. Swords and axes rose and fell. Spears jabbed at men climbing over the low sides. By Grimarr's calculation, the fight had been going on for 20 minutes at least, which meant the Sea Riders were making a bold stand. But Grimarr could see they were greatly outnumbered. "They don't see us," he thought. The world of men in battle did not extend beyond the borders of the fight. No one had yet noticed Eagle's Wing coming up fast astern. Grimarr clenched his teeth in impotent fury. "Bastards! Whore's sons! I'll butcher them all." He willed a ship to move more swiftly through the water, but he knew his men were pulling with every bit of power they had, and he would not shout at them and risk alerting the Irish to their presence. How beautiful it would be if he could burst in among them, unseen until his sword began to do its deadly work.
"Sandar,"
he called to his son.
"Come take the tiller."
Sandar limped aft. He would not join in the fighting, at least not in the first assault. With his wounded leg he had no agility. The injury he had sustained on a raid the year before, a wound he had taken in an honourable fight, still causing him pain. Grimarr was silently disgusted by his boy's weakness. Sandar stepped around the end of the tiller and took the smooth oak bar from Grimarr.
"Right up to Sea Rider's larboard side,"
Grimarr instructed him.
"Just smash every one of those damned curraghs right between our two ships. We'll cut those Irish dogs off and kill them where they stand."
Sandar nodded. Grimarr yielded the tiller and moved forward. He removed the cloak that was clasped around his neck, picked up his sword, which was beside him on the afterdeck, and buckled the belt around his waist. He walked forward, between the lines of men heaving at the oars. Each of them had at his side a sword or a battle-axe, whatever his preferred weapon, ready to grab. Helmets were there as well, shields on the shield racks along the ship's sides. They would not have time to don mail, but that was no matter. These Irish dogs would be cut down and fed to the creatures of the sea before they put a blade on any of the Northmen. Eagle's Wing was pierced for 32 oars, 16 per side, which meant it only took about half her crew to row her. But no man was idle now. Most of the oars had 2 men sitting side by side on the thwart, and putting considerable strength of arm into the pull.
"You men who are doubling up on oars, leave off. Come with me,"
Grimarr said, his voice a low growl.
"To arms."
One by one the men stood up from the thwarts, until the oars were single-banked. They took up their weapons, settled helmets on their heads, and followed Grimarr forward. It would not do to plough into the middle of a fight with all of the men holding oars in their hands rather than weapons. Grimarr reached the bow, and stood beside the great arching prow, with its intricate carvings that tapered to the stylized head of a screaming eagle. A quarter mile.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?